Hello, and thank you so much for listening to today's presentation. I'm thrilled and honoured to be presenting it. So thank you to Kate Swaffer and to Dementia Alliance International. So today I'm going to be talking about human rights centred practice in residential aged care. And in doing so, I'm going to be really privileging the experiences of rights for people living in the later stages of dementia who for so long have been falling through the cracks of the protections of human rights governance frameworks and approaches. And I do acknowledge the obligation and responsibility that comes with talking about the experiences of people who can't engage in this type of political community in this way, where they themselves would be able to express what they perceive as just or unjust in their own lives. And this presentation really is just another step in my lifelong solidarity project, which is inspired by my citizenship relationships with these people, where I was able to get to know a little bit more about the way they struggle just to get on with living their lives in residential aged care. So there are two parts of my session today. The first part, I'll hopefully lay out a case for the need to have human rights at the centre of care and care practices in residential aged care. And I'll do that partly through looking at what hasn't worked so far. And then I'll look at what is practically required to put human rights at the centre of practice, particularly through looking at some of the key barriers and addressing those barriers. And I'll be drawing from some different sources. Firstly, my own experience. The first half of my life, I was in the arts. And then I volunteered in residential aged care, became a personal carer for years, went back to uni part while I was working full-time and working as a lifestyle coordinator, then in various management and executive roles, such as National Strategy and Innovation Manager for ARCare. And for the last few years, I've been a consultant internationally, working in this from small households to really large institutions with not-for-profit and for-profit. And in the course of that, I've really become reacquainted with some of the patterns of barriers and sometimes brick walls that get in the way of human rights in this context. And those who know my work to date will know my whole life work in aged care has been around relationship-centred care and relationships. But I've really learned that that's not enough. And my dissertation looked at this not enoughness through critically analysing 3 sections of my own experience in my own journey and development as someone working and advocating in this space. And the first section of that is where I came and approached aged care as the artist when I was volunteering and first starting to work. And I didn't know about aged care or dementia. So I approached people living in the later stages of dementia with a real sense of joy and play and curiosity, and those who are really focused on spiritual, psychosocial or well-being and arts-based approaches will really relate to that section of my journey. And the second section is when I became a worker in the system and my role as a lifestyle and in various roles working in the system, and how that joy and beauty was so compromised and then even employed in the service of the institution and in perpetuating the injustice of that system. And thirdly, where my political understanding and awareness developed, and I could begin to see how power and oppression worked within these institutions, and there the need to re-engineer residential aged care, putting human rights at the centre of everything, really became clear. So that's what I'll be talking about. Thirdly, is my actual experience of late in implementing in working with a really courageous organisation here in Australia in their commitment to embark on doing just that. So re-engineering the way they do residential aged care, putting human rights at the very centre of care and care practices. So I'd like to start off by just acknowledging that residential aged care or long-term care, no one wants it. No one wants to end up there. No one wants residential aged care. We're spending all this money on something nobody wants. At least no one wants what it does. So you have the World Health Organization noting issues with human rights in this space, the OECD pointing out that things are particularly bad in these spaces for people living in the later stages of dementia. And here in Australia, we have a Royal Commission. And as you can imagine, the imagery and stories that have emerged throughout that commission have been truly awful. Stories of abuse, neglect, really horrific stuff. Thankfully, in my experience internationally, I've found those overt acts of abuse to be relatively rare. However, in my work here and internationally, I have found horror, and it's an insidious kind of day-to-day horror. And I found it everywhere, in conversations, in presentations, interactions, policies, at every level across residential aged care. Sometimes I would be in the same room with really trusted colleagues, and we'd be looking at exactly the same thing, and yet the horror seemed to be invisible to them. And this horror continues, and it's perpetuated by good people who feel like they're doing good work by making others do what is good for them. And making other people do what we think is good for them is paternalism. And paternalism is the antithesis of human rights. And never has there been a more relevant definition of paternalism than this quote by C.S. Lewis. And I will read it out. Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under the omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. And there isn't time to go into paternalism today, but Dworkin notes that there's different types of paternalism. There's rational, irrational, conscious, unconscious, emotional. And he goes on to note that getting to the point where paternalism is even considered, to get there, a threshold really has to be considered. It's required in terms of looking at the severity or the likelihood of the harm or benefit. Paternalism, though, in residential aged care, it doesn't seem to capture the same kind of limelight as the big news stories about the really overt acts of abuse and neglect. But paternalism, it permeates all levels of residential aged care, and it structures the tiny, countless moments that make up people's lives. Again, paternalism is the antithesis of human rights. And I've just got a couple of slides here. The first one, I'll just warn you that I've tried to record this in a number of different ways, but it seems that the system in Australia, the NBN, is a bit slow. So the audio is fine, but the movie's a bit stuttered. But you will get the idea. You will see and get the idea of what's happening within just one of these tiny moments that we've been able to capture.
Good morning. It's time to get up. Come on, let's go. It's already 9 in the morning and you've already missed the breakfast. The other way. All right. You already missed the breakfast. Come on, let's go. Let's go. Come on. Let's go. Here. Hold on here.
And there you have it. Staff training won't fix that. Seeing the whole person won't get to it. Reading the resident's life story, that won't change it. Devising specific tricks to get the resident up without protest, that just feeds into the paternalism. And the thing is, that carer will leave and she'll document the success of that interaction and then go home feeling that she's done a really good job. So here's another example of just one of the countless day-to-day moments in this space.
So I just wanted to talk about Mum. She seems to be putting on a lot of weight lately. I really want to cut out the desserts.
Look, I get it. We've been trying to cut down on her food intake.
Yeah, because she sits around, she's not active, and I really just think the desserts need to stop.
Well, she's sneaky. She'll just take some extra desserts and put down in her top drawer.
She really is.
You know what? I'll put down in my progress notes that you've requested not to give her any more desserts.
That's really appreciated. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks, bye-bye.
Take care.
See ya.
And did you hear that? Just the casual conversation in the lounge area, the tone, that sense of entitlement, and a real lack of clear boundaries around what they're talking about. And even name calling. I mean, no one should be spoken like that or behind their back. This is clearly all about the desires of others and some kind of supposed clinical reasoning that has overruled that resident's choice to eat dessert. And then a son desiring things for his mother's body that he doesn't even demand for his own, that you can see in the image. And both of them will walk away feeling really good about themselves. This interaction would tick all of the boxes in relation to the current aged care standards, the Charter of Rights, and even the newly proposed human rights-based approach that's starting to emerge from the Royal Commission here. There is nothing to protect that citizen resident that they're speaking about in that conversation, not the legislation, legal powers, the standards, resident rights. Nothing will protect her from the goodwill of these people.
So
And finally, just one more tiny example of yet another countless moment in this space.
All right, I think that's about it for today. Now, just one more thing. Get all the residents out of their room for this activity happening in the ground floor this afternoon.
Few residents like John, they prefer staying in the room at this time. And then Nancy, she's watching her favorite show, Boulder the Beautiful. And she's gonna be really annoyed if I keep her asking to come outside.
No, I can't have them isolating themselves in the rooms. We've got a duty of care. Anyways, it's gonna be good for them.
All right.
And did you hear that? Speaking with such confidence about something that she knows, obviously doesn't know about. And we're going to need to really focus on this idea of duty of care with what's coming out of the Royal Commission. But she doesn't understand that duty of care is a legal obligation that will rarely, if ever, mean imposing the opinions or wishes of someone on another person, especially against their will, unless, of course, there's a real severe and immediate risk to the safety of the resident or someone else, a threshold. This is just about the opinion of the nurse. And you can see she feels really good about herself enforcing it. So there's nothing to protect Nancy. She wasn't even warned that this would happen when she moved in. She did not consent to this level of paternalism and that kind of restriction, that casual restriction of her human rights. I mean, when did we ever think that any of this was okay? So I think the thing that stands out to me and always has stood out to me is just the casualness. The casualness that's the real horror, the relentless casualness of it. The fact no one's trying to hide what they're doing. They don't think there's anything wrong with it. And Barak describes this kind of thing as institutional structural violence. And this is sanctified and codified across all levels of an institution that keeps treating people like child patients rather than as adult citizens, which emboldens a whole range of quasi-experts as they boss people around for their own good in every area of their lives, and they don't even notice they're doing it. It's the medical model that sets the tone of ethics and practice and interaction here. And under that medical model, if you think back to that sleeping woman, her protests, her turning away, and even attempting to push the staff member away would be seen as behaviours because she has dementia as physical refusal of care or just simply refusal of care, when it was actually, in the real word, probably more about the efficiencies in relation to having those set breakfast times, or maybe the idea of it making a medication round easier so that everyone can be given their meds in the dining room. It wasn't any clearly considered consideration of critical clinical decisions. So people's efforts to live their lives as citizens in the context of their vulnerability are thwarted at every level, at every turn. Their control over how they use their energy, their protests against this type of injustice, they're all invisibilized and depoliticized. And so these tiny, countless moments that make up people's lives, they remain key sites for unchallenged and unquestioned oppression and injustice. So really, I think because I've said the word medical model and referred to clinical, I think it's really important just to highlight what I'm referring to here. So excellent clinical care is not in a dichotomous or binary relationship with human rights and citizenship. Excellent clinical care where this is needed is fundamental to a human rights approach. It's not an either or, and everyone needs to stop pretending to be confused about that. What it's about is just about recognizing that non-critical clinical everyday decisions, tasks, desires, experiences, expressions, and functions in residential aged care that are central to human rights and citizenship should not be subject to clinical sanction, to the desires of others, or institutional efficiencies. It's not saying we need less clinical care or less better. We need more investment in excellent clinical care. But it's not everything. Pointing out the need to move beyond classifying behaviours like her resistance to care or moods or protests and the distresses of people living with dementia, saying that we've got to really stop classifying them as symptoms of dementia is not a denial that these expressions occur. I'm specifically putting my conversation in this presentation in the context of residential aged care. So this is about holding to account professional institutions that claim expertise in supporting people living with dementia and thus in accommodating these expressions. It's not about people living at home with their own families. As one family member said to me, if drugging him, forcing him to stay with my schedules was the answer, I could have kept him at home. And finally, critiquing deficit-based systems and approaches to old age and dementia is certainly not a denial of the disabilities that frequently accompany old age and dementia. It's just about saying that these type of vulnerabilities, they're not a surprise. Vulnerability is a natural and important part of our human experience. Vulnerability is actually the one thing we all have in common. It truly is universal. And not just when we're really, really old or really young, but throughout our lives. Think about COVID, accidents, disease, climate change, all of us. It's a call to stop expecting people to put up with all manner of human rights breaches, including sacrificing their freedoms and all of the other things they desire to do with their time and their lives, simply because they're in some way vulnerable. I mean, if we're lucky enough to get older, vulnerability comes with the territory. And things like dementia, they're not outliers. Dementia is the leading cause of death for women in Australia, just like me. And with an aging population, that window of our vulnerability is getting bigger and bigger. So you'd think we'd begin to put some more energy into making this section of our lives better. But just look at what we've put in place to deal with our universal vulnerabilities. We allow experts to define and manage it and to limit and shape our full experience of being human, to treat it like it's a surprise and something that really almost can be avoided. So what I'm talking about is challenging the focus on deficit-based approaches is about recognizing how absolutely heartbreaking it is that we all live in such dread of vulnerability in whatever form that takes, because we can't shake this cult of perfection and because we've not developed systems and institutions that are set up to humanely recognize and to support our universal vulnerability. So this is all of these things is what I'm referring to when I'm critiquing the medical model. And paternalism is a legacy of that medical model where the good in what's good for you is obviously a medical good. And then it's up to staff to be in charge of policing this good, which is codified across every level of residential aged care at the moment. So what's been tried so far? A whole range of things. What type of things have we put in place to attempt to make these places more humane for everyone, but in particular for people living in the later stages of dementia? So we've had person-centered care, really individualized care, looking at getting really individualized information. But for people living in the later stages of dementia, who's providing this individualized information? Usually family, if there is a family, and usually at a really stressful time through a whole range of assessments. But these things only capture a stagnant snapshot of a person from someone else's perspective. Person-centered care involves having really good-hearted staff who read care plans and who we try and train to be really focused on putting that personhood back. So training's focused on the psychosocial, on getting staff to see the whole person, on getting pretty much on getting them to think better thoughts. But it does nothing to challenge the paternalism that we just saw, or the broader context that this is all happening in. And the personalised information, because of that, is then used instrumentally to achieve still those clinical outcomes we talked about earlier. So people are still bossed around now just in a really individualised way. So then there's relationship-centred care, and that's been my life's work. But just thinking of the video with the son, you can see how that would look like a really, relationship-centered care, but it clearly doesn't address the power in those relationships, let alone that medicalized context that those relationships are operating in. There's nothing to set the tone or the parameters of those relationships, or to ensure that when conversations like that happen that we just witnessed, they're committed to privileging the citizen resident rather than driven by the anxieties of family or professional knowledge. On the most basic level even, it doesn't account for the fact that there actually are some really evil people out there, staff members and family. There's people with not great motives. So then we've got consumer-directed care and that whole choice and rights framework, but really consumer-directed care for people living in the later stages of dementia. Exactly who is directing the care? And how are we listening to the people who no longer use words? Exactly how are they directing their services and care? We've got a whole range of aged care standards and charters of rights, complaints mechanisms. But this, again, does nothing to address that oppressive context. Think about those videos. You can focus on individual rights and on individualized care, but nothing addresses that oppressive and persistent context and those conditions that breed the kind of casual breaching of human rights that we witnessed. And these instruments, they're really quick to resort to the and or. So they'll say, the resident and or family have a right to make decisions. Yeah, how is that going to help in the context of the situation we saw with the family member and the staff member? It absolutely doesn't demand that the systems are designed and feedback loops that actually capture the voices of really vulnerable people. It's like it's just all too hard. Then we have the new standards in Australia, this focus on informed decision-making and maintaining identity. Obviously, informed decision-making isn't going to work for people in the later stages of dementia. And we've got this idea of maintaining identity, but identity as described by who? In terms of complaints, these are people living in the later stages of dementia. That's always going to be proxy. So we've had a whole range of culture change culture change initiatives within the culture change movement. And this movement aligns itself with person-centered care or relationship-centered care and proposes a whole range of operational shifts and aspirational goals. But for whatever reason, aside from maybe some really rare pockets of practice, it just hasn't caught on. And it seems to be pretty fragile to leadership and to personalities. So for whatever reason, the movement's been around a long time and things are still generally pretty bad. Then we've got lifestyle, spiritual, psychosocial and arts-based programs. They're some of them really gorgeous, but they exist within this medicalised system and are then really planned and instrumental sort of in terms of within the context of medicalised and paternalistic assumptions. Just think of the video of the woman sleeping, just that alone. Imagine that later in the day she gets to attend a really lovely choir, to be visited by elder clowns in the afternoon, or have a gorgeous intergenerational activity. I mean, that's really great, but her day-to-day life in residential aged care remains the same. And so at best, these programs offer a short recourse, and at worst, they feed into that eternalism and oppression, the paternalism and oppression. I mean, think about what we've all seen, I'm sure, some of the absolutely inappropriate engagement opportunities that happen in residential aged care. Humiliating, many of them are humiliating. They involve funny hats, deflated balloons. The important thing to remember about these really often really lovely programs is that even the most gorgeous moments of reciprocity and engagement, and even the ones that have been designed to promote embodied understanding and inclusion in social life for people living in the later stages of dementia, these take place in a context of deep injustice, casual human rights breaches, and relentless paternalism. So in this space, we've had a whole push on dementia training, some of it government funded, some of it coming from a whole range of different perspectives, but it seems a lot of it to be really focused on deciphering, managing and documenting the behaviours, moods and expressions, distresses and protests of people living with dementia, which in the training tends to categorise these things as symptoms of dementia. And this symptoms of dementia framework, it makes it really difficult for staff to recognise what they would naturally recognise in other people and even in themselves, including pain, humiliation, joy, pride, respect, or those genuine protests against unjust circumstances. I mean, think about the woman sleeping, her resistance to care. That resistance is seen as a symptom of dementia, not simply a desire that's expressed on that day. So we've had a whole lot of technology developed for this space, and it's very different than the technology that's been developed in home care. So in residential aged care, it tends to be focused on proving efficiencies. So it may be a robot or an engagement thing, but often at the end of the study, it'll be one of the aims will be to reduce staff time, or really specifically other kind of methods of surveillance. And there's really nothing governing its development. Often the developers claim to be guided by person-centred care, but they have no conception of human rights or privacy in relation to people's private medical and lifestyle information. It's like there's no rules. Again, it's like it just doesn't matter. So we've all heard the real different approaches to physical design, from the small households to the huge fake villages. Firstly, I want you to think about the videos and those countless tiny acts of paternalism. They would be no better or worse in any particular physical design. But the focus of late has been on smaller households, because there are aspects of that model that make really good practice a bit easier for staff. And since that's been a focus, I've heard a lot of people call for more research into small households, so that it can be more evidence-based. But I have to ask, evidence-based to do what exactly? I mean, if you can imagine a larger study for all human beings in relation to what is better for humans, living in apartments, living in the city, living in suburbia or a small village, which is better for humans? And of course, if you pitch it like that, the answer is so obvious that, of course, we'd immediately highlight that everyone's different. And so some of us like living alone in apartments or in the city or on a farm. And if we carried that across, we might also be prompted to ask, well, what do you mean by better anyway? And that gets to the research, the countless and endless amounts of research in the residential aged care long-term care space, because there's a call for evidence-based, evidence-informed everything, but really remembering that this research is operating under and in support of highly medicalised and highly paternalistic assumptions. And so really, residents are just sitting ducks for these researchers. They're an always accessible sample that are in a system that simply will not allow itself to be fixed because it will not courageously take a look at what it's actually doing. It won't take account of the evidence that no one wants it. No one wants what it does. And so the World Health Organization, in their development of a global action plan on the public health response to dementia, they suggest that the problems can only be addressed through framing these institutions and their failings in relation to human rights. And they particularly highlighted for people living with dementia the importance of drawing on the United Nations Convention on Rights for Persons with Disabilities, and who recommended that staff training in residential aged care be centred around human rights. So what are human rights? A human rights perspective and approach, it just takes it as fundamental that every human being, including people living in the later stages of dementia and including all people living in residential aged care, have inalienable and universal rights. So it sits out of culture and expert opinions. It's for all humans. And the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, this was developed as it became really clear over time that some groups, including people with disabilities, were not enjoying the same access or standards of human rights as other people. And as a result, the UN developed specific covenants to cover these excluded people. And the CRPD was adopted in 2006, and Australia became party in 2008. And under disability within the UN CRPD, it's a very broad definition of disabilities, and it covers a whole range of disabilities from sensory, physical, intellectual, cognitive, and other types of disabilities. So not all older people are vulnerable, and not all people living with dementia are old, but most people living in residential aged care experience one or more of these disabilities, including the disabilities that come from living with dementia. And it's important to note that human rights aren't bestowed. You don't have to work for them. They can't be taken away. There's no caveats around it. So it sidelines debates about personhood, capacity. No one has to prove anything in order to have human rights. They're not bestowed, they're claimed in the context of people's lives, in their relationships and communities. So Article 12, this is the most contentious and relevant article to what we'll be talking about in terms of the UN CRPD. And it was designed to really address that legacy of paternalism that we've been talking about, especially the stripping away of human and citizenship rights associated with substitute decision-making. It outlines the rights of persons with disabilities to enjoy legal capacity on an equal basis with others in all aspects of life, highlighting that people have a right to make their own decisions and to be provided with decision-making support, giving effect to their current will and preferences. And what's really important here in terms of people living in the later stages of dementia is this concept of current, in reference of respecting, protecting and promoting self-determination. It means if we really are going to take this seriously, we need to look closely at a few things. Firstly, people living in the later stages of dementia primarily express their desires, their will, their preferences and connections non-verbally. So through their emotions, facial expressions, body language, their actions and reactions to things. Yet non-verbal expressions of will and preference are not respected equally in residential aged care with verbal expressions. And this becomes even more precarious for people living with dementia because a range of these non-verbal expressions of will and preference are frequently perceived and treated by staff as though they're symptoms of dementia. And secondly, we need to look at the fact that people living in the later stages of dementia frequently live their lives and experience their desires, will and preferences in the moment. And yet care delivery is based on those static proxy assessments we spoke about earlier. And often when we're looking at a behavior and what it means, the intentionality, the meaning, even the appropriateness of what is currently being expressed by a resident, it's judged by whether it's consistent with previous values or preferences or identity. And again, that's as described by other people. And lastly, people living in the later stages of dementia experience life in a shifting reality that so often the rest of us don't have access to. So how can we possibly judge continuity with those previous values anyway, when we don't know what the person is currently actually perceiving and experiencing? And that's where we hear things like, well, mum would have never done that, which is pretty much equivalent to saying, well, mum isn't here anymore. The only valid person is that person I remember from the past. So there seems to be absolutely no conception of growth, how the experience of living with dementia and living in residential aged care changes a person. The person here, right now, before us, that person living in the context of their own vulnerability in residential aged care, just trying to get on with their lives as citizens. So the Article 12, it really, as it stands, it does conflict with existing legislation and practice in residential aged care in Australia, and the guardianship and powers of attorney laws that even vary in every state and territory. And because of this, in 2014, the Australian Law Reform Commission developed some decision-making principles to reflect what they themselves describe as a paradigm shift that is required in relation to Article 12 and residential aged care. We won't go through it all today, but clearly this idea that decision-making it cannot be substitute decision-making is completely supported by the decision-making principles. And just highlight principle 4, in 2017, the ALRC focused on that in relation to elder abuse, noting that residential aged care organisations really have an obligation to develop policies and staff training to ensure that staff themselves are aware of the different forms of elder abuse and undue influence that can take place, just as they do with bank tellers. The Cognitive Decline Partnership took it a step further for people living with dementia. They were here in Australia, and they came up with some policy guidelines for residential aged care around Article 12. But unfortunately, those guidelines, they do not work for people living in the later stages of dementia in residential aged care. Firstly, they're focused on decision-making in meetings or in static assessment situations where people are just sitting there together, which really leads to that kind of tick box approach. Yep, mum was sitting at the table. Yep. Rather than being focused on in the moment where people living in the later stages of dementia live as self-determining citizens. Next, the only reference made in these policy guidelines to supporting residents to express their will and preferences non-verbally is still focused around cognition. So it still talks about implementing alternative communication support, such as talking mats. And again, all of those things are focused on certain aspects of cognition and finding out that people living in the later stages of dementia don't have access to. There's no privileging people's emotions and what they're expressing is unjust, or the connections they're making in the moment in the real world. And other work to date, there's been a lot of focus on, well, how can we make Article 12 work for people living in the later stages of dementia? And I know that the European Alzheimer's Europe did some work on this, especially, and they kind of got to maybe looking at embodied agency, emotional reflexivity, some of the work of Geraldine Boyle, these expressions of will and preference to sort of understand how we can look at decision making. But again, that doesn't get to the oppressive context. And I want you to really remember the citizens in those videos. Each of them made their choices really clear to staff, both verbally and non-verbally. I mean, it was clear that that woman didn't want to get out of bed. It was clear the mother had chosen to have dessert. It was clear that Nancy wanted to watch Bold and the Beautiful. So it really wasn't, I mean, people made their wishes clear. It's just that those expressions were either pathologized, dismissed, or overruled for the person's own good. In terms of Article 12, it's really clear that we have a moral obligation in relation to Article 12 and people living in the later stages of dementia. We have to do better. We can't just say it's too hard. So this kind of marks the beginning of the second part of my presentation, where I'll be outlining some of the really practical barriers to practically implementing human rights practices and approaches in residential aged care. And in this, I'm drawing on, again, my embodied experience working in this space for so many years, and in working in change management for a range of organisations, and more recently with Mercy Health, who is the organisation I'm working with here in Australia, in their efforts to implement human rights-based approaches. And over about 14 months, I worked with close to 1,000 of their staff in 4-hour workshops, where we really were able to look at some of the tiny moments of practice and how human rights operated in those tiny spaces. And we had one part of the session was groups of staff getting into groups of 3 or 4 and coming up with skits about those little dramas about those tiny spaces. And they came up on stage and acted them out. And the rest of us got to really analyse, well, what was happening with human rights in that space. That's some of the movies that you just saw earlier. Those movies were taken from the skits, some of the really from the staff skits. So the first thing I would say is, again, obviously there's deeply ingrained medical assumptions and paternalism in residential aged care. This all or nothing when people move in. Every aspect of their lives is assessed for its clinical outcomes and benefits. You're under the complete control of staff. And this is what staff thought their job purpose was all about. When you talk to them, we all heard in the sessions and watched each other talking and performing this paternalism. And as we worked together as peers, we were really able to call this out. It really stood out to us. So this focus on financial efficiencies, I will firstly say there isn't enough resources in residential aged care to support human rights practice, and it's absolutely unforgivable and appalling that younger people with disabilities living in the community are given resources so they can live their lives, some of them 24-hour support, but older people living with comparable disabilities, they're not. They're abandoned. It's like they don't matter. But I will say that this focus on financial efficiencies in residential aged care has become really convoluted. And staff and leadership themselves really don't know where the lines actually are in relation to values of efficiency, the clinical and genuine and immediate risks to safety. I mean, you will hear nurses say, no, we have to get them out of bed. It's really good for them. When deep down they know, no, this is just because breakfast is only available for an hour, or because we have to do medication rounds in the dining room. So it's really blurred, and I feel sorry for leaders working in that space because of that. So that we've got this regulative focus on choice and personalised care, this choice and rights framework, and this, when we get a visit from the government, you know, it's really evidenced largely through the documentation, and they'll really judge an organisation about how person-centred or personalised the care plan is. And so, of course, the system absolutely focuses its really limited resources on developing these meaningless reams of documentation and this tick box approach to really proving that residents have made choices and that individualised care has been given. And everyone's so busy creating these detailed personalised care plans, honestly, some of them hundreds of pages long, and that's not including progress notes, that it actually makes the clinical information less clear and more difficult to access for nurses, who are the ones who are actually reading it. In my opinion, this creates risk. I think we need more medicalised care plans, more clearer, more succinct. I think we've done nurses a disservice there, including our training for them, asking nurses to to see the whole person, to be person-centred. Look, that's lovely and everything, but when you've got 2 nurses to 60 carers, I'm sorry, but we need our registered nurses focusing on clinical. We need them 100% focusing on clinical decision-making and on upskilling personal carers, if anything. I think we've really done our nursing staff a disservice there, and we've compromised clinical care for that reason. So of course we've got compliance anxiety in every region I worked in. So there's these policies and procedures I'm seeing that have been developed within organisations where usually it's a couple of individuals or a small clinical governance committee or team that have relied on their own interpretation of the aged care standards, or of what they believe duty of care is, or how we operationalise these legal powers. And this is incredibly dangerous, because for opinions and decisions that are sometimes knee-jerk reactions to a visit, where a government representative might say, well, that person's been in their room a long time, bang, now all of a sudden no residents can stay in their room. And the ramifications of these people's opinion that then become codified, the ramifications in the real world in relation to human rights and the experience of human rights for residents are profound. And I've constantly surprised how people's interpretation of the standards can differ by organisation, by individuals within organisations, and it just isn't good enough. So methods, we talk about things like having resident meetings, quality audits, surveys, a whole lot of co-design methodologies for residential aged care, but they're not designed to accommodate all abilities. And the OECD puts it at about 70% of people are living with the type of cognitive changes in long-term care or residential aged care that would make their ability to participate in these methodologies impossible. So we've got 70% of people whose voices we're not hearing, and yet we persist with methods of surveys and audits and co-design that doesn't work for them. We keep persisting with them. It's, again, it really is like it just doesn't matter. So these resident meetings, human rights, we've got a whole approach that seems to be, as soon as someone moves in, it's just assumed that someone else will have a say or be kept up to date about every minute of their day-to-day lives. And I've spoken to residents who really weren't warned about this before they moved in. The term next of kin, it's completely used as a catch-all. It's got no link to actual legal powers or even capacity. Again, and these legal powers are informally sort of put in place the second someone moves in. They really don't understand the difference between legal powers and next of kin. So you've got long drop-down list of next of kin, and sometimes people's neighbours being called about care plan evaluations and reviews or falls. So there's a real lack of clarity around privacy and decision-making in relation to family. And this makes it incredibly difficult for staff, especially. I think it makes it really difficult for family as well. They have no one's been given clear guidelines about how human rights are protected in this space. Again, first of all, thinking about the person waking up, being woken up. Yes, it could be because of efficiencies or because of breakfast, but often it's also about the fact staff will say, well, if I don't get them up, the daughter's going to be really angry when she comes in. So there's this, it's really setting everyone up for a failure in that space, that these things haven't been clearly defined. The threshold hasn't been established. So the threshold for the discussion of, paternalism, the threshold that would guide the meeting where the family members talking about dessert. And we often find that even really forward-thinking organisations, they would, because they haven't developed a threshold, they may immediately go to things like, well, let's look at the least restrictive alternative, maybe give her a low-fat dessert. And nobody's actually said, wait a minute, we shouldn't even be talking about this in the first place. The threshold hasn't been reached. So we haven't determined What is a critical clinical decision? So it became clear throughout my experience that we seem to adopt the same approach to day-to-day decisions as to those that pose a real risk to the safety of a resident or others. So these culture change initiatives, talking them through with staff and based on my own experience, I've really found that there's some real misunderstandings around, they'll have ideas of a whole lot of aspirational operational shifts, such as, flexibility and consistency, but these are invariably presented as nice to haves rather than viewed as absolute non-negotiables that should be codified and audited for compliance. Things like consistency in staffing, things like flexible breakfast, the real basics that you would think people had right that they don't, they're presented as nice to haves, and a real wrong approach taken to staff empowerment and change management. So in my experience, just implementing things like consistent assignment, I'll hear, well, we need to get staff buy-in for things like that. When those things are not about staff buy-in, they're non-negotiables. Think about something comparable in a maternity ward. Imagine saying, well, the nurses, they're not really into feeding the babies, so we need to do some change management and get their buy-in to get them to feed babies. We would never have that conversation. There's non-negotiables that don't involve staff buy-in that need to be established to begin with. That overarching culture change philosophy that all voices are equal and heard. A, it's not true for people living in the later stages of dementia. And B, it shouldn't be true. This idea that somehow we all have a seat at the table and a right to an opinion, which then extends to the tiny details of a resident's life that should never, ever have been up for discussion in the first place. And within this culture change movement, I came across many organisations that were quick to share their amazing art or intergenerational program. And it seemed to me that I'd witnessed this horrific stuff in day-to-day practice, and somehow these positives shifted attention away from that and shifted attention away from the urgent need to address this profound injustice at policy and operational levels. So research and evidence-based everything. People at every level demanding evidence for things that should never have been researched in the first place. Things and freedoms that any one of us would expect, regardless of whether they'd been sanctioned by medical professionals or our families. I mean, even things like listening to music, engaging in art, hanging out with your grandkids, what evidence do we need if people enjoy those things? Then we've got things like consistent assignment. I don't think we need research. You ask anyone if they would choose to have 29 different people having access to their naked bodies in a month, or 4. So research to prove what? Is it to prove financial efficiencies, clinical outcomes, or better management of what staff themselves have determined to be the behaviours of a resident who's living there? And then the barrier around dementia training and the approach within residential aged care to the behaviours and expressions of people living with dementia, and especially into, this dementia training around behaviours, it really isn't helping. You cannot implement human rights approaches at the same time that staff are trained to see the expressions as symptoms of dementia. Think about the videos. Think about the video of the sleeping woman that's perceived as resistance to care. And the training that is developed is still offering case studies like, John was up in the middle of the night. Staff tried to get him back to bed. They tried everything, but he wouldn't comply. So they looked at his staff history and they found out, oh, he's a dairy farmer. That's why he's up in the middle of the night. Now, in all of my years of experience on the floor and in management, I would have seen an easy example like that maybe twice. So it's really damaging to train staff that this is the way they deal with behaviours. And I get up at 3 o'clock in the morning I usually make myself a cup of tea. I've got no idea why I'm awake. I certainly don't have a whole group of people running around talking about my circadian rhythms or my previous professions. You know, and even offering a cup of tea to the resident living there in the current context would be viewed and documented as an intervention. And in this space, the pressure to document behaviours is strong. It's in Australia, it's incentivised. But it's trained, staff are trained that this is scientific, charting the time, the expression, the trigger, the intervention. But this is not scientific in the same way as taking a blood pressure or temperature. Ultimately, this comes down to staff subjective opinion. So the resident is at the mercy of staff objective opinion. In the case of the woman in bed, the objective opinion was that that was a behaviour and it ought to be overruled and she ought to be gotten up. So all of the expressions of pain and non-compliance, resistance, the protests against injustice or the claims for justice in this very unjust context, these continue to be viewed as symptoms of dementia, and this is codified and incentivised throughout the system in residential aged care. And I can say there is absolutely no possibility for human rights in residential aged care for people living with dementia until this has been resolved. It is absolutely impossible. You know, if often, again, it's things like being up in the middle of the night that led to their placement in residential aged care in the first place. Family just can't survive being on that type of a schedule. They can't stay up all night. They'll be destroyed the next day. But residential aged care has 24-hour-a-day staff, and they're fresh staff. And this type of thing is supposedly their core business. And yet still they're given bed licenses when they've got rotating staffing or impossibly long hallways or set meal times. It doesn't work, but that doesn't seem to matter. It doesn't seem to matter in relation to people living in the later stages of dementia and their expressions in this space. So it's really clear that we need to explore practical alternative ways through which human rights might be secured for people living in the later stages of dementia. They're offered no protection legally or through market ideology or through rights-based governance standards in residential aged care. We've seen that. They are not protected. Think about the videos. And this highlights the work I'm doing currently with Mercy Health Aged Care here in Australia in re-engineering residential aged care so that human rights are at the centre. There are other human rights instruments that are available and that are really important, but we've found that the CRPD works best to address the specific barriers in residential aged care outlined earlier, particularly in relation to people living in the later stages of dementia. And we really need to get that right before we even start thinking about belonging, the psychosocial, and even access to the broader community. We need to get this right first, as we saw in the videos. So in putting this together, in restructuring, to start with, we developed operational non-negotiables. So these are things that do not require staff buy-in, and they cover all of the things that you would imagine based on the barriers we just looked. Things like no-wake policies, non-negotiables around privacy, meal times, self-determination, childish artwork and activities, and especially around consistent assignment. Firstly, because people want it, we all would. But secondly, because it really is the only way to align with Article 12 in respect to people living in the later stages of dementia and supporting their self-determination. And also think about COVID. Consistent assignment correctly implemented means not only staff working in the same home or even just on the same floor, it means them working with exactly the same 6 to 8 residents every time they come to work. So those operational non-negotiables that are put in place have so many positive outcomes in a whole lot of different ways. And unfortunately, having spoken to people even leading up with the Royal Commission task force and things, I speak about the really basic things like flexible meals and in particular consistent assignment. And it's like it's just a bit boring for everyone. Or it's like people think, well, they were doing that 10 years ago. I can tell you, I've worked with 10 different organisations here in Australia, and I can tell you they're not. And they're not doing it correctly. Having a consistent team isn't consistent assignment. These things need to be in place. They're boring. They don't look as impressive, but they need to be in place first and foremost before anything else is implemented. And that's what organisations need to do. So some really clear practice non-negotiables to some of the things that are non-negotiables within these practice non-negotiables, a lot of those things exist already within existing current codes of conduct for organisations, but there's just no consequences when they're not followed. Again, it's like it just doesn't matter. And for staff who want to do it right, they become, and they've told me, they become really disheartened that these things aren't followed up in the real world. So things like no pet names, the tone of voice people use, access to people's private belongings, the sharing of information, just adopting that real countenance of authority we saw, definitely covering how we speak about people behind their backs. And one really important practice shift in relation to people living in the later stages of dementia is moving in residential aged care, moving beyond those judgmental behavioural frameworks, working with staff to first and foremost focus and vigilance on physical pain, not seeing whatever the expression is as a symptom of dementia. And then secondly, ensuring all non-negotiables are in place. For example, if there is inconsistency or if someone's been forced out of bed that morning or spoken to like a child, how can we possibly separate that from and the natural responses to that from symptoms of dementia? And then, of course, focusing on not inflicting further spiritual, social, or psychic pain. And underpinning that new approach, that new practice non-negotiable, is an openness, a commitment to openness and humility. So particularly humility in terms of being comfortable with not having all the answers. Once we've ruled out pain and we really can't work it out, it's committing just to be there with someone without judgment. Just to say I'm here, even though I don't know what's going on for you as a human being. And I will say that these non-negotiables need to be in place before we get to operationalizing Article 12 for everyone. Otherwise, we are just asking for misunderstandings. I mean, you can just imagine family visiting and being really upset, mum's still in bed, without consistency in staffing and the practical accountability, but also the trust that develops with those types of long-term relationships. How could family possibly trust that mum just hadn't been forgotten on a rotating roster? So family should be given a one-page weekly schedule with the days of the week that's repeated the same each week. And that highlights the personal carers across each of the 3 shifts, morning, afternoon, and overnight, that is supporting their family member on each of those days. So they could be in Uruguay and look at it and go, it's Wednesday morning, right, Khalid's with mum. It isn't rocket science. This has absolutely been done, implemented and maintained successfully over years. I've personally witnessed it. It's been achieved across large and small organisations, but it is not the norm. And it needs to be implemented strictly. That one-pager, families should demand it. They shouldn't take for granted, oh, we've got a consistent team, well, we're doing that. Show me the one-pager. Families and residents should absolutely demand that one-pager, because I don't see how human rights can happen without proof and the real practical implementation of consistency across each shift. And then we can get to Article 12, making sure that's clarified for everyone from day one. So a commitment to respecting the current will and preferences of a resident. And real clarity that when a person's capacity to make a decision or express a decision is impaired, then the organisation will utilise supported decision making, and again, giving effect to the residents' current will and preferences. The current will of a resident is a measure of their self-determination, and it's a matter of human rights that this be upheld. So decision-making powers, it needs to be made clear that these are only used for the purpose that they are allowed under law, and again, giving effect to the resident's current will and preferences. Commitment across the board to respecting verbal and non-verbal expressions of will and preference equally, and really clarifying for everyone from day one the difference between critical clinical decisions and non-critical clinical decisions and day-to-day choices, making that threshold clear for everyone. And making it also clear we don't need to understand or comprehend or say, oh, look, he used to be a dairy farmer. We don't have to know that to be able to link in the moment expressions to sort of have to say, yep, that's part of previous identity or values in order for them to be respected. All of those non-negotiables and Article 12, as you can imagine, they affect all departments, go across so many policies and procedures, all of them really from admission to finance to marketing to clinical quality, HR, everything. So in order for those human rights to be consistently applied across each department, I developed a human rights assessment tool based on the Convention on Rights for Persons with Disabilities that was based on, which is pretty much based on the operational and practice non-negotiables, and then developed a map, a detailed map of the key resident touch points across their journey in residential aged care. So before they move in, marketing, things like that, to their first month moving in, to their life in residential aged care, to moving out, just mapping out that entire journey. And the human rights assessment tool is used to consistently tease out misalignments and explore human right risks and opportunities at each of these touch points. And because of that, you can map out how each department fits in with each of these touch points. And the tool unpacks these misalignments and really gets to the reasons for these misalignments in 3 areas. So firstly, in attitudes, beliefs and assumptions, and that's an important one. So included with that is a discussion guide that really forces you to keep drilling down until the actual reason for whatever the proposed restriction of rights until that's actually been named and arrived at. It can be used by colleagues working on policies across different departments, and it's really helpful in conversations and in case conferences. First of all, it gets to, well, what is the proposed harm or benefit? What is the likelihood of it? And then the reason for it. So is this really more about other people's desires or opinions, or is this what someone thinks is best for the resident? Is this because of an existing routine or schedule, or is this a resource issue? So is this because we don't have enough resources internally, or it may be because the citizen resident themselves doesn't even have access to their own financial resources. So a key part of all of this so far is really actually arriving at the reason. Even if it can't be fixed, it's being honest about what is the real reason for the proposed restriction of rights. And existing policies, procedures. So this includes a policy analysis, recommendations, and just some recommendations for actions for each department once a misalignment has been found. So it includes a practical guide for all meetings, audits, surveys, consumer engagement exercises to ensure that adequate accommodations have been made to accommodate all abilities. And this includes calling out existing methods that do not accommodate all abilities. And a big part of that, I would say, is consistent assignment, where every 2 to 3 months, when a care plan's evaluated, residents get to feedback on their 4 to 5 carers, showing them actual photos so they don't have to rely on memory. And so if you've got 6 to 8 residents feeding back on the same 4 or 5 staff every 2 to 3 months, it means even if the resident can't express something with words, it's their peer residents who are actually being cared for by those same staff members who are feeding back. So it's not just an abstract proxy from family, yes, we like her. We're actually getting closer to more creative ways to find out what the experience is for this resident of, especially how care is being provided. So the third reason we're looking at is external pressures, and we hear that a lot. So it may be a sense of pressure from the aged care standards, or legal powers, or being on the news, or complaints, or the quality auditors. But those external pressures, making it really clear that this is the type of thing that leads to over-compliance, or designing policies and systems, again, based on some person's interpretation of those legal powers, the legislation or the standards. And that's just no longer good enough. We really require expertise in a whole range of areas before putting a policy in place that's going to result in the restriction of rights for residents. And this particular policy, or whatever it is, needs to be reinterpreted through the lens of the CRPD. So we developed a whole range of resources to clarify this approach and commitment for everyone from day one. So before people choose the organisation, there's videos, separate ones for family and for residents, summaries, some real clarity around Article 12, including thresholds. And this is that's developed for family members, external professionals, government representatives, and really importantly for residents themselves before they move in. So they've got real faith that their rights are going to be protected, and that just because they change address, they don't believe that they need to sign them over, as a lot of them currently do. So the resources really ensure that everyone's clear, and that we all agree from the start that even when things get difficult and really complex, even when staff and family members need to talk, when we have those conversations, we're going to be privileging the citizen resident, not our own anxieties or professional opinions. Everyone is so clear about the risk that paternalism poses to human rights from the start. And so considering that really quick overview of the tools and approach and resources that have been developed to implement the CRPD across an organisation, I just want to briefly look at one case study. Now, this is from the real world, and it was actually a case study that a manager brought to the discussion as, we'll see, this human rights thing isn't going to work because this is a real situation. So you tell me what that means. So often the tool was really developed based on some of that problem-based thinking and real problems that were happening in the real world. So let me just read this to you, and I'm sure that those who work in the real world of residential aged care will be accustomed to these type of situations. So a resident with Parkinson's disease and moderate cognitive impairment could be found each day extremely distressed and smashing on the front door of the home to get out. All he wanted was to go back to his local yacht club, which was in walking distance, for a few hours, as he had done his entire working life. Each weekday, he had enjoyed a few cold beers with friends while admiring the view of his yacht and the ocean. It was assessed that it was no longer safe for him to go on his own. Long-term care is simply not funded to provide this type of one-on-one support to get a staff member to go with him. External behaviour experts were called in, and they made some recommendations, including offering him a drink or distracting him with a walk around the home. Family rejected the manager's suggestion that the man's own financial resources be used to hire someone to actually assist him to the club each day. 2 weeks later, the man lost balance while trying to open the front door, and he ended up in hospital with a broken hip. That's one of the real world complex situations that we face every day. For those of you who don't work in residential aged care, this is what life is like. So often I present this to people, and their first response is, well, what about volunteers? Could we creatively use volunteers? And my response is, well, why? This man owns boats out on the bay and a few houses. Why does he now have to have imposed charity? just because he's living in residential aged care. So even just a cursory look through the human rights discussion guide that was developed, it'll highlight that this is actually a resource issue, and in this case, a personal resource issue that speaks to the potential of financial elder abuse. And so addressing this does not require external behaviour experts, drugs, restraint, or distraction. It requires experts in the field of financial elder abuse and what can be done. This is not a clinical matter. It ceased to be a clinical matter after the clinical decision that he wasn't safe to go on his own, which was absolutely the right decision. But after that, it is no longer a clinical matter in this context. And so when we call in experts to assist managers in these really complex areas, of course, we wouldn't be calling in behaviour experts or dementia experts or clinicians. We would be calling in people who are experts in financial elder abuse and powers of attorney and guardianship and whatnot. So finally, a human rights approach. What does it take? It absolutely takes a new role, and that's a dedicated human rights executive with codified authority above clinical. And this role needs to oversee also what research gets done and to ensure that the research is really transparent about the assumptions it makes about dementia, old age and vulnerability, and how this research will actually contribute to human rights practice. And then a human rights ethics committee to oversee the transition and to provide that expert support in particular really complex cases. Experts in fields such as human rights law, disability law, ethicists. You cannot leave these hugely important decisions and in relation especially to interpretation of the law or the standards to a single person or clinical team. These have shocking ramifications in the real world for residents living with dementia. So we developed a comprehensive training and orientation program. The movies come from that actual training program. And that training has to have a critical component to ensure that all staff are really switched on and aware of those legacies of the medical model and the power of institutions. If you want human rights practice, you need human rights training, and then you need a commitment that this work can no longer be naive to power. Although we cannot stay in stage one being the lovely artists, we have to move to being vigilant and to be aware of these deeply embedded assumptions. The work can no longer be apolitical. So staff training needs to address that. It needs to address human rights, and it needs to support staff to recognise their own role and the political agency of everyone working together as peers in challenging the legacies of the medical model and just making sure that people are getting on with living their lives. The training is about finding ways for staff to see. So to see paternalism, to see ageism, to see dementiaism. Once you see these things, you can't unsee them. And so then in this context, in a rights-based context, solidarity is the defining characteristic of staff practice and of staff-resident relationships. We really need to move beyond. We need love. It is fragile to this institutional structural violence, and we need to move beyond that idea of finding loving people, finding nice people, or throwing so many training resources at turning staff into nicer people or more loving people. This psychosocial approach to recruitment, training and practice does nothing to address those legacies that we discussed in this context. Again, at best, that psychosocial training approach, at best, it is fragile. It almost burns out the very staff you might want to be replicating. It is solidarity as a citizenship practice. Solidarity, as defined by action researcher Kabir in her citizenship work with marginalised and vulnerable people in the global south. Her understanding of solidarity is the capacity to identify with others and to act in unity with them in their claims for justice and recognition. So this understanding solidarity is one of the 4 principles in Ruth Lister's model of inclusive citizenship and human rights, which is a political approach, parts of which have informed this work and informed this presentation. Final thoughts. What does it take? It takes a revolution informed by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It cannot tinker around the edges. It takes a revolution. It's not something that someone saw at a conference and now wants to make everyone do, or is trying to talk everyone into. This is a non-negotiable revolution. It takes a complete re-engineering of residential aged care to put human rights at the centre. It takes courageous institutions and staff who feel supported in calling out injustice. And finally, it takes human rights. I've found that human rights works on a multitude of levels in residential aged care, especially in relation to dementia and vulnerability and that power of the medical model, because human rights have a history. Their very existence remind us that we do terrible things to one another, from wars to genocide to drilling holes in one another's head to make things better. We haven't always got it right, and that humility is vital in terms of calling out this powerful knowledge that is parading around as if it's fact, that can't be wrong and can't be changed. And that provides a real sense of hope across the spectrum of roles in aged care, a real sense of hope that solidarity can actually be a practice. It offers real possibilities for a transformative pathway, rather than letting people fall through the cracks of these existing rights and choice governance frameworks, which we have seen do not work for people living in the later stages of dementia. So thank you so much for listening to this presentation, and thank you again to Kate and to Dementia Alliance International for inviting me to develop this. Thank you.